Hello and warm wishes to all my fellow Americans, wherever you live, whoever you love, and whatever you believe. My name is John Russo, and this is Stranded in Centerfield. Americans born before 1970 can remember a time when there were virtually no homeless people living on our streets. Now, today, just 50 years later, large homeless populations are living and often dying in the public's parks and roadways. How did this happen? Homelessness is a blank screen issue. What I mean by that is people tend to project what they already believe onto the screen to confirm their view. Those who self identify as progressives say that homelessness is an indictment of heartless capitalism. And those who claim to be conservatives say homelessness is a function of an overly permissive society. Actually, while both contentions are partially true, neither is the sole explanation. The homeless population is not a monolith with a single characteristic. It breaks down into four groups with significant overlap among the groups. The first group are people who have had a bad turn of events in their lives, either through their own fault or because of bad luck. This is the only group that many kind hearted people acknowledge. Now, back in the early 1980s and late 1970s, when the deindustrialization of the American economy first became obvious, many of us saw all homeless people in this light. We saw them as victims of cruel economic circumstance. Now, this naive and simplistic view has become far less widespread as more people are confronted with the actual reality of who is in the homeless populations. But there are many people out there on the streets who have had a bad break and can turn their lives around. This is the group that can make the most of help, and they should be helped. Now, in my experience, this group is not a majority of the homeless population, but they represent a large enough group of people that their needs should be addressed. Now, the second group are the mentally ill. Throughout most of the 20th century, people who were suffering from severe mental illness were hidden from public view and warehoused in huge, horrible state institutions. Our society made little pretense of trying to help these poor souls. We just didn't want to see them. Now, by the late 1960s, Americans had been made well aware of the injustice and callousness of this approach. And at the same time, the counterculture of that era began espousing a very dangerous notion, the pernicious idea that mental illness wasn't real at all. Movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which got several Oscars and which was adapted from a book written by LSD enthusiast and beatnik Ken Kesey, taught that crazy people weren't actually crazy at all, just different from you and me, and that the conformist gray flannel American society were made so uncomfortable and frightened by these free spirits that it imprisoned them by calling them mentally ill. Now, at the same time that this cultural change was happening, governors like California's Ronald Reagan and New York's Nelson Rockefeller responded humanely to the real horrors of the warehouse model by promoting a policy of deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. Deinstitutionalization was supposed to make the care of the mentally ill more humane through the use of decentralized group homes that would reintegrate these suffering folks back into society while providing them the attention that they needed. There was, however, a big obstacle to this well meaning approach. Nobody wanted a group home on their block or in their immediate neighborhood. And a more tailored and effective level of therapy for mentally ill persons was way more expensive than just warehousing all of the mentally ill. And so, while the early 1970s saw the beginning of the end of America's post war boom, it also brought about a decade of public budgets marked by austerity and service cuts. State governments decided that they could not afford to fund a decentralized mental health approach. And the outcome? No more big institutions and no money for treatment in small group homes. And hence, a lot of mentally ill people ended up out on the street. This group of the homeless desperately needs medical care, therapy, and drugs. They represent probably as much as half of the homeless population. Now, the third group are substance addicts, alcohol or drugs. Now, this is where the overlap among the groups is most pronounced because many mentally ill people often self medicate if they aren't getting the care that they need. Also, and let's be honest, if you were part of the first group of homeless and you found yourself living on the streets because of a bad break in your life, or worse, because you made some stupid and awful decisions when you were younger with your life, you might want to get wasted to escape reality. I consider myself a pretty resilient person, but I'm not too proud to say that had I not been so fortunate in my life, I could easily have been that guy. It is widely acknowledged that the vast majority of the homeless fall into this group of substance abusers. Now, this gets us to the fourth and last general group. I call them the Sons of Anarchy. These are usually just bad guys, criminals, petty thieves, frauds, people who just don't accept the rules, man. They're usually immature, often violent idiots. The mass media has utterly failed in reporting an essential dynamic associated with homelessness, and that is this: homeless encampments nearly always establish themselves nearby existing criminal networks. Car break ins, burglaries, thefts, low level drug dealing, these are a significant source of encampment income, much of which goes back into substance abuse. Now, some well meaning homeless advocates complain that breaking up encampments does nothing. They're wrong. It does disrupt the chop shops, whose demand for stolen cars to break into parts, and the fences, who deal in stolen household goods and jewelry, create the market for petty crime against the rest of us and against other homeless people themselves. Homelessness comes from bad choices made by our leaders, our culture, and often by the homeless individuals themselves. These bad choices include a lack of resources to treat mental illness, a misunderstanding of the nature of mental illness, a system of land use and regulation that makes new housing construction much too difficult and way too expensive to build, and a naive refusal to acknowledge the internal economics of homeless encampments and their relation to property crime networks. Homelessness is not an inalterable fact of American life. It is the result of bad choices, often well intentioned over the past 50 years. We can solve homelessness, but to do so, we have to dump the ideological and partisan explanations and start behaving the way Americans have historically approached tough problems: pragmatically and results based. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Please leave your civil comments and suggestions below. This is John Russo saying, I'm not stranded, and neither are you. There are millions of us Americans standing together here in Centerfield. Until next time.